Judge Edward Miller sat at the bench, his stern eyes scanning the courtroom. It was an ordinary Tuesday, and his docket was full of minor cases. Traffic violations, petty theft, a few small claims disputes. He had long since grown accustomed to the rhythm of these days, where the rules of the court governed everything. He didn't mind it. In fact, it was something he prided himself on: fairness. After years of experience, Judge Miller believed that the law was the law, and it didn't play favorites. Whether the defendant was a high-ranking officer or a local shopkeeper, the outcome was always the same. That's when Captain Vanessa Harris stepped into the room. She was tall, with an air of quiet authority, dressed in an impeccably tailored military uniform that suggested both strength and professionalism. Her dark eyes scanned the room briefly, making eye contact with the judge for a split second before she turned her focus to the proceedings. Her posture was perfect, a slight hint of tension in the way she held herself, as though every movement mattered. Judge Miller noted the uniform. The military. He had seen a few service members in his courtroom over the years, though mostly for minor issues, nothing serious. Still, there was something different about her. He couldn't place it. Perhaps it was the way she carried herself, the calm confidence that seemed to emanate from her without effort. Or perhaps it was the respect she commanded in a room full of strangers. Captain Vanessa Harris. The officer called her name. The sound of her title felt significant in the space. She wasn't just any person in the courtroom. She held a position of authority, one that demanded respect. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at his paperwork. A minor traffic infraction. Something about failing to signal while changing lanes, he noted. Not the most important case on the docket, but it still required attention. "Captain Harris, is it?" the judge asked, looking up. "Yes, Your Honor," Vanessa replied smoothly, her voice calm but firm. There was no hesitation, no defensive tone. She wasn't there to challenge the system. She was just going through the motions, as one would when they knew they had no reason to be treated differently. Judge Miller briefly reviewed the case file and then proceeded with the hearing. Vanessa didn't try to explain herself or offer excuses. She simply nodded when the judge noted the offense, acknowledging it without protest. Perhaps it was a small mistake, but the law had to be upheld. It was what he always believed. Given the severity of the offense, Judge Miller declared, "I'm imposing a fine of $250. Vanessa nodded again, accepting the fine without a word. Her demeanor remained unchanged, even though Judge Miller couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was something more to her than the case led on. As she turned to leave, the judge glanced at her for a moment, a flicker of curiosity crossing his mind. He couldn't help but wonder what someone like her was doing in his courtroom for such a small infraction. There was an air about her that suggested she had a much larger purpose, something far beyond this courtroom. Yet there was no way of knowing. Not yet, anyway. She walked out without a word, leaving the judge to ponder what, exactly, he had just witnessed. As the court session continued, Judge Miller moved through the rest of the cases with his usual efficiency, but his mind kept drifting back to Captain Vanessa Harris. She had left the courtroom as quietly as she had entered, but her presence lingered in the air. There was something about her that didn't quite sit right with his usual assessments. She wasn't a typical defendant, not by any stretch of the imagination. By the end of the day, the judge had dismissed all the other cases and was gathering his papers when his clerk, Sarah, approached him with a few final files. She looked at him for a moment before speaking. "Judge Miller, I notice you seemed a little off today after Captain Harris's case," Sarah said, her voice gentle but curious. "Off," he repeated, glancing up from the papers on his desk. "Well, you kept looking at her as she left, almost like you were thinking about something more than the fine," Sarah added, her expression thoughtful. Judge Miller paused, his hand stilling over the papers. "I suppose I was." He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling for a moment, as if trying to piece together his thoughts. Something about her didn't fit with the case. A woman of her stature, why would she be in here for a simple infraction? Sarah nodded but didn't press further. She didn't seem fazed by the fine at all, did she? No, not at all, he replied, his brow furrowing slightly. There was a kind of calmness about her, like this whole thing was beneath her, but not in an arrogant way, more like she was just going through the motions, as if it was a minor inconvenience. Maybe she's just used to being in control, Sarah suggested with a small shrug. After all, she's an army officer, right? The mention of her military status caused something to click in the judge's mind. He knew he'd seen her name in passing before, probably in some local news story, maybe about community work or a military initiative. But he hadn't connected the dots earlier. That evening, after he finished his work at the courthouse, Judge Miller found himself back in his office at home, doing something he rarely did, Googling. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he typed in the name Captain Vanessa Harris. What he found astonished him. Vanessa Harris wasn't just any officer. She was a senior figure in the U.S. Army, known for her leadership on programs that promoted diversity and inclusion within military ranks. She had been instrumental in initiatives that encouraged equal opportunities for women, people of color, and other underrepresented groups within the armed forces. Articles, interviews, and accolades all told the same story. Captain Harris wasn't just any military officer. She was a trailblazer, dedicated to reshaping how the Army operated at its core. The realization hit the judge hard. He had found a woman who had done more for equality and opportunity than most people could ever dream of, and he had dismissed her with the same impartiality he applied to all cases. But something didn't sit right with him anymore. He had been quick to judge, perhaps too quick. And now, with new information at hand, he wondered if he had made a mistake. Judge Miller sat back in his chair, staring at the screen. The more he read about Captain Vanessa Harris, the more the weight of his earlier decision pressed on him. Her leadership in the Army's diversity programs was not just impressive, it was transformative. He read about her work with mentoring initiatives that had helped thousands of young recruits, especially those from marginalized backgrounds, to rise through the ranks. Articles described how she had pushed for policy changes that ensured equal access to training, promotions, and assignments, all in the name of fairness and inclusion. Her work had been recognized nationally. She had been featured in several interviews, invited to speak at military conferences, and even awarded honors for her contributions to the modern military's evolution. She wasn't just an officer. She was an advocate, a symbol of progress within an institution often criticized for its slow pace in embracing change. The judge's stomach twisted. He had, in his mind, treated her case like any other minor infraction. But the woman who had stood before him, calm and collected, had done so much more than simply serve her country. She had been actively changing the face of it, pushing for a military that was more inclusive, more equitable, and more representative of the nation's diversity. But he hadn't seen any of that when she stood in his courtroom. All he had seen was a woman in uniform with a minor traffic violation. He leaned forward and started reading deeper into the details of her projects. Her work wasn't just a footnote in military culture. It was part of a larger movement, a movement that had made the Army a model for other institutions to follow when it came to creating more equitable environments. Her accomplishments weren't confined to her rank or position. They had ripple effects that reached far beyond the military. The more he read, the more his initial impression of her faded. He realized how wrong he had been to assume that a fine was an appropriate response. It wasn't that the fine had been unjust, but the context, the person behind the case, had been completely overlooked. This wasn't just a random citizen paying for a minor infraction. This was someone who had spent her life fighting for fairness, leading by example. The judge felt a mix of admiration and shame. He had been so quick to impose a penalty, so wrapped up in his routine, that he hadn't even paused to question the significance of the individual standing before him. What he had initially chalked up to a routine case now felt like a missed opportunity to connect with someone whose mission aligned with his own values of justice and fairness. He closed his laptop and sat back in his chair, grappling with the realization that his actions had not just been impersonal, they had been misplaced. He wondered if there was a way to make things right. Could a simple apology be enough? Or would it take more? Judge Miller couldn't shake the feeling that something needed to be done. He had always prided himself on being fair, impartial, and unclouded by personal bias. Yet now, reflecting on the case, he recognized that he had allowed assumptions to shape his decision. He hadn't taken a moment to understand the person standing before him, to consider the depth of her role in society. Captain Vanessa Harris wasn't just any defendant in his courtroom. She was an individual who had dedicated her life to promoting justice and equality, values he himself held dear. The judge spent the following day in a haze, unable to focus on his usual responsibilities. His thoughts kept returning to the case and the woman whose life's work now seemed so much larger than the brief moment she had spent in his courtroom. It wasn't that the fine was unjust. It was the context of it, the backdrop of who she was, that felt wrong. He had acted as though she were just another person who'd made a simple mistake, overlooking the fact that her entire career was devoted to rectifying larger, systemic issues of fairness. He couldn't help but feel that he had undermined her efforts, reducing her to a minor infraction when, in reality, she was part of a greater movement for change. In the quiet of his office, the judge found himself reflecting on his own life and career. He had always believed that the law was about equality, about treating everyone the same, regardless of their background or identity. But the more he thought about Vanessa's work, the more he understood that equality wasn't about ignoring people's differences. It was about recognizing those differences and ensuring that everyone had the same opportunities, the same access to fairness. It wasn't just about rules, it was about people. Later that afternoon, Sarah, his clerk, stopped by his office with a pile of paperwork. She noticed the judge's contemplative mood. "You've been quiet today, Your Honor," she remarked, setting the papers on his desk. Judge Miller glanced up at her, his brow furrowed. "I've been thinking." Sarah raised an eyebrow, sensing something more serious behind his words. "About the case?" "Yes," he said, leaning back in his chair. "About Captain Harris. I think I've misjudged her." Sarah tilted her head, intrigued. "In what way?" "I've always believed that fairness was about treating everyone equally, without favoritism. But what I've realized is that fairness isn't about ignoring the context. It's about understanding the bigger picture, the experiences that shape a person, the work they do, and the values they represent." Sarah nodded slowly, understanding. "It sounds like you've had an epiphany." Judge Miller gave a small, rueful smile. "Maybe so. I think I need to do something about it." He turned back to the laptop, now fully intent on figuring out how to make amends. He had made a mistake, but he wasn't ready to let it define him. He knew that, with the right action, he could start to right the wrong he had done, both to Captain Harris and to his own sense of justice. The more Judge Miller thought about the situation, the more he realized that the only way to make things right was to take action. He couldn't undo the fine. He couldn't change the past, but he could try to correct the course moving forward. What he needed was to reach out to Captain Vanessa Harris, to apologize, and to begin a dialogue about the assumptions he had made. He wasn't sure where it would lead, but he knew he had to do something. The decision was not an easy one. The judge had built his career on the belief that personal feelings had no place in the courtroom, that justice was impartial and firm. Admitting that he had misjudged someone, especially someone of Vanessa's stature, felt like a vulnerability he wasn't accustomed to showing. But as the days passed, the weight of his inaction pressed on him, and he knew he could not continue without addressing it. One morning, after reviewing his court docket, he sat at his desk and composed a brief but heartfelt email to Vanessa. He kept it simple, expressing his regret over the fine, explaining that he had come to realize how much he had misunderstood her role and her importance, and requesting a meeting. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he hoped she would at least consider his apology. He clicked send and leaned back in his chair, his heart racing slightly. It felt strange to put himself in such a vulnerable position. He had never been one to admit mistakes easily, especially not in his professional life. But there was something about Vanessa's work, her calm dignity that made him feel as though this was the right thing to do. To his surprise, the response came quickly. Vanessa's email was brief but gracious. She agreed to meet him at a local cafe the following week. She wrote that she appreciated his honesty and willingness to reach out, and that she would be happy to have a conversation. When the day arrived, Judge Miller arrived early, his mind swirling with nervous anticipation. He wasn't sure what kind of reception he would receive, but he was prepared to listen. He knew the weight of his mistake and was determined to learn from it, even if it meant facing some uncomfortable truths. Vanessa arrived on time, dressed in business casual, her posture as composed as ever. She didn't look at him with any judgment, but with a quiet attentiveness that made him feel both humbled and grateful. As they exchanged pleasantries and ordered coffee, there was an unspoken understanding between them. This wasn't going to be a simple apology. It was the beginning of a conversation, one that could change both of their perspectives. "Thank you for meeting with me," Judge Miller said, his voice steady but sincere. "I've had some time to reflect on our encounter in the courtroom, and I realize now that I made a grave mistake." Vanessa nodded slightly, giving him her full attention. "I appreciate your honesty," she replied, her voice calm but warm. "We all make mistakes. It's how we handle them that matters." The judge took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. This was only the beginning, but it was a start toward understanding and growth. As they sat across from each other in the cozy cafe, the steady hum of conversation and clinking of cups around them seemed to fade into the background. Vanessa's calm presence put the judge at ease, even though he still felt a twinge of discomfort. He had never been one to seek out vulnerability, but there was something disarming about Vanessa's demeanor, a quiet strength that made him feel that perhaps this conversation could lead to something more meaningful than just an apology. "I want to be clear," Judge Miller began, his voice steady but sincere. "When you walked into that courtroom, I saw you as any other defendant. I didn't take the time to consider who you were or what you represented. And that's a mistake I deeply regret." Vanessa listened intently, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, her gaze focused on him. She didn't interrupt. She simply let him speak, her expression calm but thoughtful. "I assumed that your military uniform was just a part of the case," he continued. "That you were a person like any other, and that my job was simply to apply the law without considering context. But what I've come to understand is that the law isn't just about rules. It's about people. You've spent your career shaping systems to ensure fairness, to create opportunities for others. And I didn't see that." Vanessa's eyes softened as he spoke, but there was no judgment in her gaze. Instead, she gave him a small nod, acknowledging his words. "I appreciate your honesty, Judge Miller. It's not easy to admit when we're wrong, especially in a professional setting." The judge looked down for a moment, absorbing her words. "I've spent my life trying to be impartial, to avoid letting personal feelings or biases affect my decisions. But I now see that impartiality doesn't mean ignoring a person's story, their work, their contributions. It means understanding them, seeing them fully for who they are." Vanessa leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but firm. "I understand. In my role in the Army, I've had to challenge a lot of assumptions myself. There are people who see me as just another officer in uniform, not recognizing that I'm a black woman working in a historically white, male-dominated institution. It's easy to overlook people when we don't take the time to understand them." Her words hit a chord in the judge, and for the first time, he truly grasped the depth of the struggle that many faced, including Vanessa. It wasn't just about the work she was doing in the military. It was about the barriers she had to break down just to do that work. He thought about the many times he had assumed that fairness was simply about equality in treatment, but now, he was beginning to see that true fairness was about recognizing and dismantling the very systems that made certain people invisible. "I admire your work," the judge said, his voice quieter now. "And I realize that my role isn't just to uphold the law, but to recognize when those laws need to evolve. when they need to be shaped to reflect the realities of the people they affect. Vanessa smiled slightly, her expression a mixture of appreciation and encouragement. "It's not an easy path," she said, "but it's a necessary one. And it's good to see people like you who are willing to look at their own actions and challenge themselves. It's how we grow, both as individuals and as a society." For a moment, there was a silence between them, one of mutual understanding. The judge had come to this meeting with the intention of apologizing, but now, as he sat across from Vanessa, he realized that he wasn't just seeking redemption. He was also learning from her, gaining insight into the deeper meanings of justice and fairness. It wasn't just about rules. It was about people, about their stories, and about recognizing the complexities that shaped them. "I'd like to learn more," Judge Miller said, looking up at her. "Not just about your work, but about the challenges you faced. I think there's a lot I could learn from you." Vanessa smiled, a warmth in her eyes. "I'd be happy to share. It's conversations like this that lead to change, on both sides." The judge felt a surge of gratitude. This conversation wasn't just a chance to apologize. It was the beginning of a journey, one where he would come to understand the law, fairness, and justice in a whole new light. And he was ready to listen. In the weeks that followed, Judge Miller found himself reflecting on his conversation with Captain Vanessa Harris. He had walked into that cafe with an apology on his lips, but what he walked away with was far more than that. He had come to understand the importance of seeing people fully, of recognizing their work and their contributions, especially when it came to matters of justice and equality. His conversation with Vanessa had challenged his assumptions, and it had reshaped his understanding of what it meant to truly serve the public. But more than anything, the judge realized that what had happened in that courtroom, the decision he had made based on incomplete information, could not simply remain between him and Vanessa. He had a responsibility to be transparent with the community he served, to acknowledge his mistake in a way that would allow others to learn from it as well. It wasn't just about his personal growth. It was about setting an example for others in his position, showing that the willingness to admit mistakes and learn from them was crucial for anyone who held power. One evening, as he sat at his desk, the judge composed a letter to the local newspaper. He had debated how best to frame his thoughts. He wanted to be honest, but also thoughtful, ensuring that his message was one of growth and understanding, not just an apology, but a reflection on the lessons he had learned. In the letter, Judge Miller spoke candidly about his experience with Captain Harris and how it had made him realize the limitations of his earlier thinking. He shared his understanding that fairness wasn't about treating everyone the same. It was about recognizing and valuing each individual's unique story and contributions. He acknowledged that by failing to do so, he had not only misjudged Vanessa, but had also missed an opportunity to truly embody the values he had always championed as a judge. He ended the letter by urging others in the community to take a closer look at their own assumptions. "We all have a role to play in shaping the kind of society we want to live in," he wrote. "It's not just about laws and rules. It's about understanding, empathy, and the willingness to grow." When the letter was published the next morning, it stirred a quiet but powerful reaction in the community. Some people expressed surprise at the judge's openness, while others commended him for his honesty and self-reflection. The local news outlets picked up the story, and soon, others were commenting on how rare it was for someone in such a position of authority to admit when they were wrong. Vanessa, too, saw the letter. She didn't reach out immediately, but when she did, it was to thank the judge for taking the step to share his experience. "I appreciate your words," she wrote in a short but heartfelt message. "It's not always easy to show vulnerability, but your willingness to do so will have an impact on others." Judge Miller felt a deep sense of fulfillment reading her message. In acknowledging his mistake publicly, he had not only found redemption, but had also helped to start a conversation about the importance of understanding, empathy, and growth in the pursuit of justice. What started as a simple mistake in his courtroom had transformed into something much larger, a learning opportunity, not just for him, but for everyone involved. And with Vanessa's ongoing support, The judge was committed to continuing that journey of growth and understanding. He knew that true justice wasn't just about the application of laws. It was about the continual work of seeing people as they truly are, and of always striving to do better. Months passed since the judge's public acknowledgement, and the impact of his letter began to ripple through the community in ways he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about his apology. It was about a shift in perspective. Judge Miller found himself approached by colleagues, community leaders, and even everyday citizens, many of whom shared their own stories of learning and growth. The idea of challenging assumptions, of viewing people through a lens of empathy and understanding, had sparked conversations in various corners of the city. It was as if the letter had opened a door that had long been closed, allowing for deeper, more meaningful discussions about justice, equity, and fairness. One of the most unexpected outcomes was the invitation from the local community center to speak at an event focused on diversity and inclusion. The organizers had read about his apology and felt it would be valuable for the judge to share his journey and the lessons he had learned. At first, Judge Miller hesitated. He had always viewed his role as one of impartiality, not as a public figure leading discussions on social issues. But after some reflection, he realized that this was exactly the kind of opportunity he had been waiting for, the chance to continue his learning and to help others see the importance of empathy in the pursuit of justice. The night of the event, Judge Miller stood in front of a packed room, nervous yet determined. He had prepared a short speech, but he knew the real value would come from speaking honestly, just as he had in his letter. When he took the stage, he began with a simple introduction, acknowledging the mistake he had made when he first encountered Captain Vanessa Harris. He shared how that moment had been a turning point, not only for him, but for his entire perspective on justice. He spoke of the importance of understanding the person behind the case, of recognizing their unique story, and of how true fairness could only be achieved when one took the time to listen, reflect, and grow. The audience listened intently, and by the time he finished, there was a quiet but palpable sense of connection in the room. Judge Miller had not only admitted his past mistake, but had also used it as a stepping stone for a broader conversation about the importance of seeing people for who they truly were. His words were met with applause, not just for his bravery in admitting fault, but for his willingness to evolve and contribute to the conversation about how to create a more inclusive, just society. As the event came to a close, Vanessa approached the judge, her presence as composed as ever. She smiled warmly, her eyes reflecting pride. "You did well," she said, her voice filled with genuine admiration. The judge smiled back, feeling a sense of fulfillment he hadn't expected. "Thank you, Captain. I couldn't have done this without you." In that moment, Judge Miller realized that his encounter with Vanessa had not only altered the course of his career, it had also helped him become a better person. Through their conversations and the lessons he had learned, he had come to understand that justice wasn't just about applying laws. It was about ensuring that everyone, regardless of background or identity, had an equal chance to be heard, valued, and respected. Vanessa's role in his transformation, as well as his own commitment to change, had become part of a larger movement, one that would continue to unfold as long as people were willing to listen, reflect, and grow. Judge Miller understood now that justice wasn't a destination. It was an ongoing journey, and it was one he would continue to walk with a deeper understanding of the people he served.